All right, guys, so who is more extreme, Americans or Europeans? I think that Americans are extreme in their own way, and I think that Europeans are extreme in their own way. Europeans will look to Americans and they'll say, those people are crazy because they own all these guns. They have all these guns, mein Gott. And then Americans will look to Europeans and they will say, no, those Europeans are crazy because they have no guns. I hope in this video to come to a middle ground in this debate. So who is more extreme? I think that Americans are definitely extreme in their own way, and I think that Europeans are definitely extreme in their own way. So in the United States, we have survivalist fanatics. We have libertarian fanatics. We have people who believe that the government at any moment could just start rounding people up simply because they're patriots or because they have the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, and put them in camps and just exterminate them. And so they can become extremely anti-government to a dangerous level. One of the biggest examples of this in American history would be the Branch Davidian cult led by David Koresh in Waco, Texas. These people truly believed that the government was after them. They believed that David Koresh was the Messiah and that the government was going to try to kill him as the Roman government killed Jesus Christ. When there was a standoff between the government and the cult would set their entire compound on fire and kill almost all of the people inside. And they did this because David Koresh told them that if they died for him, that they would descend from heaven with him in his second coming. Now, this is an extreme example, but nonetheless, it is an example of this sort of fanaticism in the U.S. There are many people in America who are members of cults. There are many cults in the U.S. There are tens of thousands of religious sects in the United States. Americans can be very religiously factionalist, and it's really just an inevitable result of America's founding, the first settling of the U.S. The first European settlers in America were extremists. They were Puritans who were leaving a country that was tired of dealing with their vicious fanaticism. The Puritans, they were fanatics. They were extremists. And they were coming to the New World to have the freedom to persecute other people. We were taught that the Puritans were leaving England for religious freedom. They were fleeing religious persecution. And that is really a distortion of the truth. The reality is that they were leaving England because England was sick and tired of their nonsense. And they were coming to the New World so that they could have the freedom to not only observe their religion, but also to persecute other religions. That's why they persecuted Catholics. So America was founded by fanatics. But let's remember that these were fanatics who were leaving a Europe that was being engulfed by fanaticism. When the Dutch first discovered Calvinism, they were willing to fight and kill and die for Calvinism. And when the English became Protestant, they were willing to kill for Protestantism. That's why they persecuted the Catholics. And eventually there was a civil war in England with the Puritans on one side and the Anglicans on the other. And so Europe got engulfed by extremism. And the Puritans were just one sect of extremists in Europe who came to America, and they brought their extremism with them. And that extremism, that spirit of rebellion and extremism, still lingers here. It just manifests itself differently. So, for example, in America, if you were to find the descendants of the earliest English settlers, more than likely, you would meet Democrats because most of them today are Democrat. If you look at the people in New England, the descendants of the first English settlers, they are mainly Democrats. And a lot of them can be very fanatic about their progressive or left-wing beliefs. A lot of them can have an extremely fanatical position regarding the death penalty. They want the utter abolishing of the death penalty. And you could show them the worst, most vicious serial killer in the world. You could have them meet someone who murdered 100 people, cut them up, cannibalize them, sodomize the bodies, the whole thing. And they would say, nope, that person deserves to live. That person deserves free room and board paid for by the state. And in their world, criminals have the right to murder the innocent, but the state has no right to kill the criminal. And the state has to provide the worst of murderers with free room and board and food, all paid for by the state. That is an extreme position. You have people in America who are so anti-immigration that they would not mind going to the border and removing any water bottles left by people who have compassion for immigrants so that these immigrants don't thirst to death. So for example, they are people who have sympathy for immigrants from Mexico who are trying to cross the border, and so they leave water bottles for them. And you have people who are so anti-immigration that they will actually come to these water bottles and remove them. They will remove the water bottles. And you could tell them, hey, you have people who thirst to death walking through the border, walking through La Frontera, as it's called, the border between the U.S. and Mexico. And they'll say, we don't care. That's not our problem. But these people could actually dehydrate to death. That doesn't matter. That's an extreme position. And that extremism entails downright murderous desires, because you don't mind if that person thirsts to death. You have people who are so anti-immigration that they want to see all immigrants removed from the U.S. They want to see the mass deportation, the mass rounding up and deportation of all undocumented immigrants, which would mean the rounding up, the mass arrests, and the mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. And that would be millions of people. You're talking millions of people. They don't care. You have people who are so extreme that they wouldn't mind if the U.S. government positioned automatic machine guns on the border. And if anyone is seen trying to cross the border, you shoot them. And they wouldn't mind it. There was a pastor, I remember. What was his name? I don't remember his name. His last name was Hull. J.D. Hull, I think his name was. He was a crazy Calvinist pastor. And he said, yeah, shoot and kill these illegal immigrants trying to cross the border. Just shoot and kill them. We've had enough of them. We've absorbed enough of them. We've taken in enough of these people. Just kill them. That's what this Pastor Hull guy said. It's an example of American extremism. And it's really a part of the legacy of extremism that's been here since the Puritans settled in the New World. So America has its own extremism. We have the highest concentration of mass shootings. We have the highest concentration of school shootings. We have a huge, huge population of serial killers in our prison population. And we have also many serial killers who are out and about right now as we speak. And in Europe, you don't really have so much of that. I've noticed, for example, if you look at the lists of serial killers by country, you'll see Mexico's got a bunch of them, England's got a lot of them, and Australia also has a lot of them. And that makes me think, is there something to be said about Anglo society and murder? Because the Australians have a lot of serial killers, America does, England does. There's something to be said about that, and I can't figure that out right now. I can't. Maybe someone can help me, though. But you'll see Germany's got some, Spain's got some. But then you look at the United States, and it's this huge list of serial killers. There's something to be said about that. And people could argue and say, well, it's because we actually document them. And that may be true. But I think that Europe also has the capability of documenting their serial killers. And I think that if Europe had just as many serial killers as the U.S., that we would know about it. I think it's safe to say that. So there is definitely a deep element of extremism in the U.S., violent extremism in the United States. We are the most violent country in the first world. There is something to be said about that. And so that could tempt one to look across the Atlantic into Europe and say, well, the Europeans don't have so many of these problems. They don't have as much of these problems as we do. The Europeans are obviously not as extreme as we are. And I think that in our current time, I'm not talking about the past, I'm not talking about the future, but right now, in our current time, Europeans are more moderate than Americans to a great extent, in the sense that they don't have all these school shootings that we have. They don't have all these spree shootings that we have. It does happen over there, but not as much as the U.S. In Europe, European cities are probably a lot safer than American cities to a great extent. And for example, if you look at the murder rate of Spain, if you look at the murder rate of Italy, it's nowhere near as high as the U.S. You could argue and say, well, it's because America has a bigger population. Okay, fine. If you compare the murder rates of the EU versus if you compare the murder rate of the EU versus the murder rate of the U.S., it's actually close to the same. They're actually quite close numbers, more or less. But if you compare America to individual European countries, those individual European countries are going to be safer than the U.S. as a country. But that is not to say that Europe does not have its own extremism. So Europe has a history of taking American extremes and amplifying them to a murderous level. So, for example, in America, we used to have Jim Crow laws in the South. And the Southern Jim Crow laws essentially were no blacks allowed in this swimming pool, no blacks allowed in this restaurant, blacks have to sit in the back of the bus, no blacks can drink from this water fountain, no blacks are allowed on this campus. That was Jim Crow. America also had forced sterilization of people who were deemed as unfit, people who had certain disabilities. The U.S. Supreme Court had a case, it was called Buck versus Bell. And in the Buck versus Bell case, the U.S. Supreme Court concluded that states had the right to forcefully sterilize certain people, and it wasn't unconstitutional. So they constitutionalized sterilization, essentially neutering human beings as if they were dogs. The Germans looked at all this from across the Atlantic, and they didn't say, well, look at those Americans. They are crazy. They are crazy. They saw what America was doing as a standard, as a precedent. Because when Buck versus Bell happened, it set a precedent for the rest of the world. America has a history of leading trends amongst the nations. And when the U.S. Supreme Court passed Buck versus Bell, when it ruled in favor for government-forced sterilization, the Germans saw that as an example to follow. Hitler was very much so in glee of what the Supreme Court did. And so the Germans commenced their own policy of eugenics, but they took it to a murderous extreme. They didn't just sterilize people. They put people in camps and murdered them. They did human experimentation on them. The Germans were also inspired by the segregation laws of the South, by Jim Crow. And they said, okay, we're not just going to segregate people, we're going to kill them. We're going to put people in camps and kill them by the millions, people that we don't like, Poles, Jews, Gypsies. All of you guys have heard this already. You guys all know this. And so that was Europe taking an American extreme and amplifying it to a murderous, genocidal level. In Croatia, you had the Ustashi, who murdered around 1 million people, mainly Serbs and Jews. In Ukraine, you had the Banderists, the Ukrainian nationalists, the UON, the UPA, these nationalist mercenaries who murdered around 100,000 people because they were Polish. So Europe has its own extremes. Yes, America has its shootings and its extremes. It has cases of racism. Yes, it has its fanatics. It has its survivalist fanatics. It has its cults. Yes, America has its own problems. But at the same time, when Europe does go extreme, watch out. You do not want to be there. If I had a choice to live in the US or Europe during the Second World War, I think you guys know my answer to that. It's quite obvious. The grass is not always greener on the other side. Many times, the grass is on fire. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.